You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this series. And in today's conversation, we're going to discuss Mexico's new focus on infrastructure. It's a brand new program, brand new strategy for them. Joining me today is Erin McLaughlin, the senior economist at the Conference Board. Welcome, Erin.
Hi, Steve.
So, Erin, you just wrote this great new analysis on infrastructure and what's happening in Mexico. Now, you focused on infrastructure in other places for a long time, but we haven't heard this from Mexico. What's going on?
So Mexico has a new president coming into office. It's actually their first female president. Her name is Claudia Sheinbaum, and she takes office on October 1st. And one of her key election promises, so we'll have to see how it works out, is that she wants to take advantage of the reshoring that we've started seeing, the trend in North America. And she has outlined various infrastructure plans and potential policies to sort of take advantage of reshoring when she comes into office.
Now, this is interesting because she is in the same vein as the current president, Obrador Lopez, and they're both pretty far left, which is, and their policies have not been pro-business or, pro-economic policies. They've been focused on other things. So this was a bit of a surprise, wasn't it?
It is a bit of a surprise. And doing this analysis has really tested my high school level Spanish. But, what I've discovered is that what she has been saying in her stump speeches and leading up to taking office is that she sees the taking advantage of reshoring and the capitalizing on this business as being good for all workers. So that's sort of how she is speaking, maybe to some of the more left-leaning, and her and the current president are of the same party, and they're pretty left-leaning from what I can tell. But that this would, be an advantage for their workforce. And so that's one of the reasons that she's promoting it.
So she's not coming at it from a pro-business perspective, but a pro-worker perspective.
Pro-worker, yes.
But it's pro-economic.
It's pro-economic development, pro-business in a way, yes.
Yeah, and you need this infrastructure in order to grow GDP, which is very smart on her part.
Yes. Their GDP has not grown as fast as some other similarly sized countries that have taken advantage of globalization. So they're a little bit behind Chile and Korea and some other countries that are around that same economic size. So there's definitely opportunity for her to grow. And what's also really interesting when you think about her sort of positioning the country is that their electric utility is generally state-run. And so a lot of the infrastructure that she has to work to put into place to take advantage of the reshoring may have to lean into the private sector more than it has up to this point as well.
Now, it's also reflective of the USMCA, which is the new term for, or the new version of NAFTA, which is the new NAFTA, which is a trade bloc with Canada, United States, and Mexico. So it's actually pretty smart policy on their part to try to get their infrastructure in place to take advantage of the USMCA.
Yes, of course, Mexico, the USMCA covers Canada, the US, Mexico. Mexico's labor force is cheaper than the US and Canadian labor force. And so, for companies looking to nearshore, US companies and global companies going to Mexico will offer some cost advantages because of the cost of labor.
Right. And so she's trying to build this as a direct and deliberate approach to reshoring. So the reshoring is coming mostly from China. Talk about what's going on there.
Right. So we have seen, and we've written about that over the last year at the Conference Board quite a bit. We have seen reshoring really taking hold, and the beginning of that is we're actually just the beginning of the trend. So one of the indices that I look at is construction spending, and construction spending on manufacturing facilities in the US has just grown exponentially, more so than any other commercial property type, by a lot, by about tenfold. So it's very, very interesting. So we're seeing that really start to happen. And the reshoring renaissance, as I call it, really started during the Trump administration when there were additional sort of tariffs put on China. And then after that, we had the pandemic and all of the supply chain issues. And so, even though our supply chain has sort of, worked itself out and we're in sort of a post-pandemic world, the appetite, especially given geopolitics, for reshoring and nearshoring is still there.
Yeah, so this follows low cost of labor. So, back in the late 50s and early 60s, it felt like everything was stamped with made in Japan. And then it became, made in other places, but most recently made in China. And it seems like we have outsourced almost all of our manufacturing to China, but that's been because there's been relatively low shipping costs and very low labor costs. So it's actually cheaper to manufacture it in China, ship it all the way across the Pacific Ocean, than it is to manufacture it at home. So this is a different strategy, and there are geopolitical issues in here, and China's rumbling towards Taiwan and all of that.
Yeah.
That U.S. businesses are now saying, no, maybe we need to bring our supply chain, our manufacturing portion of the supply chain closer to home for domestic consumption purposes. And hence, as you said, Mexico becomes a primary candidate for that, given
very logical.
Right, the labor arbitrage.
And in 2023, Mexico, for the first time, surpassed China as being our #1 country that we imported from. So China fell to second, and then Canada is actually third.
Say it one more time for our listeners, because I bet you that nobody would have guessed that.
Yes. So last year, 2023, we imported more from Mexico than any other country, and that we had been importing the most goods from China. So Mexico displaced China as our #1.
And that's before Scheinbaum,
yes.
institutes this policy. So again, it's really it seems like a very smart policy, because it can really help, provide jobs for their labor force. Eventually, the wages should increase for their labor force
and increase their quality of life. And that is part of her, and I mean, obviously, I think that's good for North America, right? That's good for our region to have a stronger economy to the south of us, potentially. Yeah.
Well, and maybe a lot of these migrants then don't have to come as far north as the U.S. and Canada if there was more robust jobs in Mexico. Also, maybe the Mexican domestic market would become a source for U.S. companies, to sell into the market.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a virtuous circle, and these are the benefits of trade, and she's really moving after this. Now, so there are benefits to U.S. companies being in Mexico or investing in Mexico, because of the distance and also geopolitical issues, yada yada yada, that we've just gone through. Now, but there are some risks that companies should consider. What are those?
Well, we broke down in our analysis that companies should really consider 4 different kinds of risks. So the first of those risks would be structural risks, which includes corruption and sort of a weaker rule of law. And that is something that is obviously very hard for a new presidential candidate or one administration to change, but that is one of the main challenges. Additional risks include operational risks, which are connected to the infrastructure and the source of energy, regulatory risks, understanding how, Mexican permitting authorities and other kinds of authorities work. And then lastly, sustainability risks. If U.S. manufacturers can't buy clean energy for their plants if they choose to open plants in Mexico, or they can't have the same sort of green supply chain, that may also impact their ability to do work as successfully.
So how would you prioritize those four risks? In the world of risk analysis, there are really big ones,
Right.
existential kinds, and then there are sort of like operational ones that, it's just a matter of cost.
Yeah, I think it depends on what is being manufactured. And it depends on the supply chain and sort of the infrastructure of that supply chain. One thing I found very interesting in doing my research is that technology is actually helping a lot with some of the security issues. So there's, very large companies that operate a lot of the industrial parks and the manufacturing facilities, and they're instituting a lot of security measures, including camera and other sort of technology-enabled security that is making the country much more secure. So, if a company does their due diligence and feels comfortable with the security aspects, I think the other prominent risk to analyze is sort of energy, electricity, and water.
Okay, so basically, does the infrastructure support the kind of
Right.
manufacturing that someone would, and it's not just in total, it's not at the GDP level, it's really down to where the manufacturing plant would be. And, is there enough water? Is there enough, and
Exactly.
is there enough electricity? Is it stable? And then is the workforce around there stable? And does it have the right skill sets for
Yes.
whatever the manufacturing needs are? So all of these kinds of assessments need to go into that. Now, there's something called the International Technology Security and Innovation Fund. Can you just describe that fund? And then, and then we can go into the significance of their partnership between the two countries.
Sure. I think when we're talking about manufacturing, reshoring and nearshoring to Mexico, we're not talking necessarily about all of the sort of goods that China is now exporting to the US. A lot of these supply chain components will be smart components. Right now, Mexico is manufacturing a lot of automobiles and the parts that go into automobiles for the US market. And, the modern automobile is full of computer chips and full of, semiconductors and sort of all of the things that encompass smart manufacturing. So it's been really interesting that the CHIPS Act has a component in it, which you referred to, for the US government to essentially analyze our allies, including Mexico, and basically help fund an analysis of how we can enable smart manufacturing, here as close as possible to North America.
So there's this fund under the CHIPS Act. So what's the significance of the U.S.-Mexico partnership in there under that fund?
Well, the U.S.-Mexico partnership enables for free trade to come between the two countries. And so, they are, unlike China, considered more of an ally when it comes to sort of secure components. So the actual fund is for the adoption of secure and trustworthy telecommunications networks to ensure that the semiconductor supply chain, can be stable for the U.S.
Okay, so your point is, because of the security issues required in the products, this allows Mexico to be a better partner or a more reliable partner, and secure partner at this level. So that's why this fund's important. But that's another piece of this potential growth for Mexico in manufacturing and providing this. Now, what do you say to the people who say, well, we shouldn't be manufacturing in Mexico at all? We should just bring the jobs home. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think we are bringing a lot of these jobs home potentially. Looking at that construction number that I referred to before, we are constructing a lot of manufacturing facilities that are smart manufacturing facilities in the US. We still have a very low unemployment rate, and we do not necessarily have the huge workforce that would be necessary to do some of these manufacturing jobs. So, I think that there's obviously a desire to bring manufacturing home to the US, but a certain kind of manufacturing, smart manufacturing. And there's no, we live in a very global world, as we all know, and I think nearshoring and protecting that supply chain to Mexico definitely has advantages for the US.
We're talking about Mexico's new focus on infrastructure. We're going to take a short break and be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge, from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Erin McLaughlin, the Senior Economist at the Conference Board. So Erin, before the break, we were talking about smart manufacturing and the new fund, the International Technology Security and Innovation Fund, which is under the CHIPS Act. But going back again to the various kinds of things that fit best to be sort of reshored from China to Mexico, what kind of categories do you think are the most appropriate?
Well, looking right now at to what is the most popular sort of categories that Mexico is already manufacturing, it includes motor vehicles and motor vehicle parts at the very top, followed by computer equipment, beverages. I believe Modelo is now the #1 beer in America for the first time. So that's interesting. Doesn't necessarily fit the rest of our discussion, and then after beverages, electrical components and electrical equipment. So Mexico is already showing and already has some of that manufacturing infrastructure in place for all of the things that would sort of also go into semiconductors and some other electrical components that we need more of from our allies. We did an analysis using the Conference Board's Global Supplier Index to see where there is room between some of the materials and the sort of the base supplies that they have in Mexico versus what they're currently manufacturing and exporting. And so we did come up with some other categories that we think that Mexico has sort of room to grow in. And these include wood and wood products, machinery and equipment, other transport equipment. So other transport equipment beyond cars, which could include things like airplane, aeronautical, farm and agriculture equipment, as well as non-metallic mineral products and chemical products.
Now, Mexico has their own supply of natural resources. In that you typically, if you're a manufacturer, you look for those, near supplies. Give us some examples of what Mexico has locally.
Well, Mexico has, its agriculture has been very popular, and some of its minerals and mineral resources have been very popular, but it does not, China and some other parts of the world are still well surpassed when it comes to some of the critical minerals we need that are not found in North America.
The rare earth minerals.
The rare earth minerals. So I think what's really interesting, and that's a subject of upcoming research that I'm doing, but I think what's really interesting, and that will be a very interesting part of this conversation, is that if the US has to change its relationship with China or Russia or other parts of the world, how do we impact their ability to send minerals to Mexico and then have elements produced and sent to the US? Supply chains are very complex. They don't just involve two countries. They often involve many countries. And so I know that one of the main discussions around nearshoring has been, what would it look like if the US has different kinds of tariffs and other limitations, for example, on Chinese imports, but China begins setting up its own plants and its own facilities in Mexico for the US market. So that is a very much a developing conversation in the economic and policy worlds, but I definitely think this is just the beginning of that conversation.
Yeah, now and to be clear, the United States has its own supply of minerals, rare
Right.
earth minerals and other minerals. But it's difficult to open new mines, and certainly there are environmental issues with opening those new mines and land usage and all sorts of things. So we don't currently have a great set of policies to deal with any of that. But that brings you to the question of Mexico. Now, if you put all if you put all this manufacturing in Mexico, um, they they're not necessarily committed to the same level of clean air, clean water, sustainability practices that the United States is, or that the government subjects the private sector to. So basically, it's like you can get by with a lot more, quote unquote, in Mexico, and hence the costs are cheaper.
Right.
But those carbon emissions are, we still spin through the same air. So,
Yes,
so
exactly.
so you have a lot of critique about is this really environmentally sustainable, or are we just turning a blind eye to, if we move manufacturing there, to what's going on there? How do you react to all that discussion?
I think that's very true. I think for US companies that have to um, detail carbon emissions through their supply chain, some of the border issues will not matter because they will still have to detail the carbon emissions.
And you're
I,
talking about scope 2, scope
yes,
3.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think the other reason, besides sort of the policies, the environmental policies that may limit the US from creating mines and us sort of, for lack of a better word, digging up our critical minerals, is also our labor supply. Going back to, we do not necessarily have that expertise, nor do we necessarily have a labor pool that is looking to do that work, which is incredibly difficult. And then we do find that in other still developing economies, it is more likely to be able to find that labor supply of people to do that kind of work.
Now, what about the safety and security concerns, for companies then investing in Mexico?
I think that's it was very interesting. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce did a significant survey asking companies about which countries they would consider reshoring or nearshoring to. And Mexico came in second to Asia. So 15% of the companies in their survey said they would look to go to other Asian countries, and 14%, so about tied, said they would go to Mexico. And when they asked, what were the biggest concerns of these companies, the safety and security measures were their biggest concerns. And so it's just very different than doing work in the US, and that it seems that often companies have to do due diligence or have to spend a more significant percentage of their operating revenue on safety and security measures in order, and that has to factor into the cost equation of creating manufacturing facilities in Mexico.
Now, to be clear, President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum's plan has not been fully fleshed out.
Right.
And so there's a lot more for them to do. But there is this part of her plan to develop industrial parks and infrastructure. Now, typically when countries or governments invest or create these parks, there are the constraints, there is the infrastructure around it,
Right.
there are the sustainability, the clean air, rules and so forth. So there is some hope. Again, it's very early on. It's not that we don't know. I mean, they haven't gotten that far, and it may well be that they get there. But the fact that they're doing this in an industrial park kind of direction suggests that there's going to be more orchestration to this than normal.
Yes. that's really what led me and attracted me to the story. When she was elected, when the election happened a couple months ago, I was reading how one of her campaign promises was 100 industrial parks, that she was going to create 100 industrial parks. And I thought, oh, how specific. And, let me delve into this and find out why do they need 100 new industrial parks? And so I learned that their vacancy rate for industrial park space right now in Mexico is 1%. And back in 2013, it was 9.5%. So every year, their industrial parks just keep leasing up. And now they are at capacity. So they really do need the industrial parks just to continue to have companies come and to grow. Industrial parks, which is kind of a very funny word to use, because, we might even be thinking in the US of like a random, flex space, officey industrial park on the outskirts of a city. But when they're describing and they're using the terminology industrial park, what they're describing in part is a very, very large pieces of land, often connected, to a port, to a freight rail, to major highways and sort of corridors throughout their country that also connect into the US. It also, these industrial parks, similar to the US and other parts of the world, have their own sort of free tax zone and free tariff zone. So there's many different components, for example, could come into a park, and essentially where there's also factories and things sort of get built and maybe even resent out for more manufacturing.
Well, it'll be interesting to see as they flesh this out what happens. As you've calculated, the potential impacts here. What do you see the potential of this new strategy on their real GDP per capita?
So different analysis has shown that their GDP could grow 3.8% annually over the next 10 years if they are able to take advantage of the reshoring trend. What's interesting is that their growth has averaged less than 1% a year for the last 40 or so years. So Mexico has not been in a position of sort of high growth, right? And during that same period, Chile, who is often compared to, grew 3% annually, and South Korea grew about 5% annually. So Mexico is about the 10th largest economy in the world. So it's not a small country, right? It is a well-populated country. And so there is a lot of room for them to sort of take advantage of it. What it really does come down to is the safety and security that we've talked about. And again, having the infrastructure in place in order to be able to move the goods and be able, but the labor pool and the cost of labor is favorable.
Any final thoughts before we close?
Well, I think we're at the beginning of this trend. And that's kind of one of the wonderful things about looking at a trend like this. We don't have a lot of data, but we can clearly see the need. We see that, Mexico has a lot of ability to seize upon reshoring and nearshoring. We see that their industrial parks are down to 1%. The other notable thing about Claudia Sheinbaum is she herself is an energy engineer, PhD. So she does understand infrastructure maybe in a way that some of the other elected officials in Mexico haven't in the past. And so I think as the US changes its relationship with China and some other countries, looking to the south and maybe wanting to see our neighbor improve economically might be of even greater benefit than we already realize.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Erin McLaughlin, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for listening to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.